Hello, this is Dan Richardson at the Chapel of the North Hills, and I'm inviting you to another of our jewels of Ephesus. Another jewel that I found in chapter 1. This is verse 18 and 19. Let me read this for you. The eyes of your understanding be enlightened, that you may know what is the hope of your calling, what are the riches and the glory of his inheritance in the saints, and what is the exceeding greatness of his power toward us who believe, according to the working of his mighty power. Paul is continuing in his prayer. He's mentioning how he is praying for the church at Ephesus. And in this paragraph, or in this little sentence, chunk of a sentence, we see that he is praying for their spiritual insight, praying that spiritually they would have a godly worldview or a biblical worldview. Sometimes we describe it now. I like to think of we need to have God-colored glasses. So we need to look at everything. Look at our life. We have to look at our circumstances. We have to look at the way God is moving in the world through God's perspective. It's a very interesting way that he describes this literally. He says that the eyes of your heart be enlightened. And that's very vivid. We don't often think of our heart having eyes. But what he's saying is that he wants us to be able to see things and know them in our heart. Okay, we need to know a couple of things. Verse 18 says that we need to know the hope of our calling, the hope of his calling, and then also the riches of the inheritance of the glory of his inheritance, and then we also need to know the immeasurable greatness of his power. The first two things there, that is the hope of his calling and the riches of his inheritance, those things relate to the future. Those are not with us now, because he's talking about the promise that he made that he would take his people, Christians, that have given their life to him and that have let Jesus come into their heart. Those people get to live in heaven. He's preparing a place so that we can be in heaven with him forever. Okay, that is the hope of his calling. That is our calling, that we keep that in mind, that future in mind. That is always going to give us the long view compared to the situations we're in now. We can look at whatever's going on in our life now and think, there's heaven in my future. There is an inheritance in my future. Now that inheritance, that's an interesting thing. It says the hope of, or the glory of his inheritance. And really, we can't determine exactly which direction that is to be interpreted, because in one way we can think about it as the inheritance that we will receive as Christians. We're children of God, and so we get to participate in the inheritance that he has given to us as his children. The other way to think about it is that we become the inheritance for him. We are his inheritance. The church is his inheritance. So in the original language, we can't decide which one is which, and that's okay, because both ways are true. You can understand it both ways and come to a great conclusion and a true conclusion both ways. Now let's look at that third one, the immeasurable greatness of his power. So God's power is this thing here that's at our life right now. We need to know that we have the ability, we have the potential of God's mighty power to help us in our life right now. It's described in here with some of the biggest words possible. Let me tell you the Greek words here. Uperbalon megathos. Megathos. Can you imagine that? megathos, uperbalon megathos. Uperbalon would be off of the ball, above the ball. So out of this world, not participating in this sphere that we're in now, but way otherworldly. That's the kind of power that it is. It's otherworldly power. And then megathos. That sounds like an alien culture transformer that's super powerful that we hear about on the movies. Megathos. It's out of this world. God's power is beyond this world. And some of the ways that it's described here is the New Living calls it incredible. The NIV says incomparable. The King James, of course, says exceeding. The NAS says surpassing. And the Christian Standard says immeasurable. So you can wrap all those things together and you might get a taste of megathos or Uperbalon megathos. It is all those things and more. And then Paul goes on and uses four words, four ways to describe this greatness here. He calls it, first of all, power, dunamis. And then he also calls it working. That's energion. And then kratos. That's the strength or might. And then another word for strength, ixus. Iskus. So God he's using four different power words right there. So not only is it out of this world, but he's describing it in four different ways right there. So this is an amazing sentence that Paul has put together. We really need to know what we have. There is a guy who had a lot of money last century. His name was William Randolph Hearst. And he was in charge of almost all of the media in the country. And so the biggest media mogul that you can imagine, he was the one that ran it all. Well, and he got a taste for art and for gathering art and collecting art. The most expensive things that he could find, he wanted them. And he read about some highly prized works of art. And he had heard about them and read about them, and so he had to have them. You know, something that's that powerful, that valuable, he just had to own it. And so he gets his assistant and he tasks him to find those things and purchase them whatever the cost. Find who owns them and find if they're on auction, whatever it takes, I want those things. Well, this assistant had to look and look. And he had to do a lot of research, and after months, he finally came up to William Randolph Hearst and said he had found them. He had located the pieces. You know where they were? They were in Hearst's own warehouse. He didn't even know what he had. Well, sometimes we forget the power that we have. The source of all power in the universe is right here to help us in our daily lives. So to maintain God's perspective, keep that God-colored glasses on, keep those God-colored glasses on, keep that biblical perspective, that biblical worldview, keep your future in focus, and take the long view. Then, whatever the circumstances turn against us, also remember the treasure that we already have in Christ. Be blessed.